I'm here with Wes Granberg-Michaelson. He's the author of the forthcoming book, Without Oars, Casting Off into a Life of Pilgrimage, and has written previous books such as From Times Square to Timbuktu, The Post-Christian West Meets the Non-Western Church, and also Future Faith, 10 Challenges for Reshaping Christianity in the 21st Century. For 17 years, Wes served as the General Secretary of the Reformed Church of America and has long been active in ecumenical initiatives such as the Global Christian Forum and Christian Churches Together. He's also now involved in a new endeavor called Faith 2020 that I'm sure we'll hear more about. So Wes, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Brian. It's really good to be able to talk with you.
Well, we've got a ton of different friends in common, and several of whom are involved in the same interview series, Faith, Hope, and Love During an Election. And so I'm really glad to have been able to work a relationship to be able to do this conversation with you.
So am I. You've talked to many of my good friends, and I'm honored to be kind of in the role with them. It's terrific.
Well, we're honored to have you. There's no question about that. So maybe we could just start by having you share your thoughts on, in general, how you feel the country is these days.
Well, Brian, we're in a period unlike any other that I've experienced in my lifetime. I had a previous experience in politics. When I first started my career, I worked as the chief legislative assistant for Senator Mark O. Hatfield, and that was during the time of the Vietnam War. It then led into the time of Watergate and President Nixon's resignation. It was a pretty conflictive time. And I've often thought of that as the most polarized and most difficult time in American political history in my lifetime. The time we're in now is far more serious and far more critical. I think we're seeing a depth of polarization that now gets deeply reinforced by the nature of communications today, and that breaks increasingly the norms and the practices that have been so important for really running and governing in a democracy. And we're also seeing religion being used far more intentionally, and I think in very damaging ways, as part of the political landscape and rhetoric. Now, look, we've always had polarization in American politics. You could find some really bad examples in U.S. history. And there's always been the problem of how does religion relate to politics, and presidents and others in power try to use it to their advantage one way or another. But this is something different. This is something far more severe. And I see the country in a real point of danger. It's at a point of political danger in terms of our democratic institutions. It's at a point of moral danger in terms of the values that we feel are most important to a cohesive society. And I think it's at a point of spiritual danger where we can become easily misled and confused about how a nation like the United States relates to providence.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more that I've never in my lifetime seen a degree of polarization, and totally agree with all the different problems that you've described that is surfacing. Given all of that, what suggestions do you have in terms of how we get past that? How we can effectively speak with people who don't necessarily share our views?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge deeper than I've known it before. Family gatherings for so many of us have a level of anxiety now that they never used to.
Yeah.
You try to avoid talking politics because you are aware that divisions run deep. But we've got to somehow get over that. And I think, Brian, the best way I know how to go forward is to is to first try to identify the values that we think are most important. And, you know, you may not be able to find common ground, but you can find at least a more fruitful dialogue. If you talk about those values and the things that we hold up as practices for Christians. Shortly after President Trump was inaugurated, I was asked to give a talk in DC, sponsored by Church of the Savior and the Festival Center. I used to be part of that congregation many years ago. And it was interesting because I tried to reflect on what did we need to remember as we look forward to a time with Donald Trump as president. And the things that I held up were memory, and for us as Christians, memory, because memory reminds us of our real story, truth, the real overarching value of truth, solidarity, the call to be in solidarity with those who are most on the margins and most suffering, and with that, the value of spiritual grounding and integrity, and that beneath all the controversy around issues, to focus on those kinds of practices. I have found that really helpful in these last 4 years and now, to try not to begin conversations around policy, but begin conversations around what are those practices and values, especially if we're talking within a Christian context, that we as Christians most hold to. And that can at least, I think, begin to identify ways in which we can go deeper instead of just be trapped in the kind of obvious political differences and polarizations we find.
So in your work with Faith 2020, it sounds like you've done some data analysis of what different types of issues Christians or different segments of Christianity are interested in. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure, and I think it's really important. Donald Trump was elected by a majority of white Christian voters. It's been well documented that 81% of evangelicals voted for him, white evangelicals. It's always important to add that. 64% of white Catholics voted for him. 57% of white mainline Protestants voted for him. And the motives behind those votes are, I think, Brian, it had as much to do with a sense that those voters felt culturally estranged and unappreciated. They sort of felt like East and West Coast elites didn't really understand their concerns and their culture, and they voted for Trump as kind of a protest against that and a desire to sort of take their life more seriously. What we see now is that there's a beginning to be a drifting away in each of those groups. Not dramatic, but when we look at the polling, it's very interesting. You ask evangelicals, do they believe that Donald Trump was morally upstanding? And only 15% would say yes. Is he truthful? Only 23% would say yes. But then if you say, does he fight for us? A large majority would say yes. And I think within that community, there's a real dialogue going on around how much does character really matter? And how much does spiritual integrity really matter? You know, our friend Ron Sider has written a book, The Spiritual Danger of Donald Trump, 30 Evangelical Voices, They're not saying vote for Biden. This was before Biden was even nominated, but they're saying here's the dangers we see after 4 years. And when you move to white Catholics and to white mainline Protestants, amongst white mainline Protestants, which people aren't talking about very much, you already see a 9-point shift from 2016 to 2018 in moving more towards Democratic candidates, and I think influenced by the impact of President Trump. Now, it only takes a shift of 4 or 5 percentage points in those groups to swing the election. And that's why I think politically, regardless of where you come down, I think this is really, really fascinating. If Vice President Biden received the same amount of support that President Obama did from white Christians, he would be elected just like that. The statistics demonstrate. I mean, McCain only had 74% of evangelical vote. Over 50% of people said Obama was friendly to religion, which you do that against other Democrat candidates. He didn't get the same response. So I think there's some really interesting issues at play. I think character, appreciation for the concerns of culture that have felt kind of bypassed. And then I think with that, Brian, comes the issue of race. People will say, what is the overriding issue in the election? And from the conservative point of view, it would always be abortion and gay rights and religious freedom. Now, there's a legitimate discussion around all three of those. But in today's context, if you say, what's the overriding religious issue before the country? I think it's race. Because the racial division, it will take reforms, it will take legislation. But, the evangelicals have a point when they used to say, even in the civil rights debate, well, racial justice requires a change of heart. Well, they usually do that because they didn't want to pass civil rights legislation. But there was a truth in what they were saying. This is, as well as a deeply historical and political issue, it's also a spiritual challenge to the nation. And I think at this time, that because of all the events, because of the racial reckoning moment we are in, I think we have to say religiously, the issue of race has to figure prominently in how we approach this moment in our nation's history.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and that was one of my next questions, honestly, was about that. And let's say for the moment that, Biden wins the election, don't know what will happen, beyond that. But what kinds of steps would you like to see taken to combat systemic racism?
Well, a lot of, I'll say very, very directly, that when you ask that question of me, it's a responsibility to answer, and I have some ideas, but I'm also aware that I'd be talking about fixing a problem I haven't lived. And I think you start that discussion by really listening to those who have lived this problem.
Yeah, you can't disagree with that, no question.
You have to start there, and a lot of efforts are of course now coming to the surface that are doing so. You've got a certain agenda that figures here, mass incarceration and the reform of the criminal justice system, in which people like Brian Stevenson have been such marvelous advocates, and Michelle Alexander and others. And some steps have been taken. We can acknowledge that, but there's great need there. The whole discussion around police, which has now become very, I would say, very confused by the phrase defunding the police, because that's a kind of phrase that means whatever meaning you want to put into it. And so it becomes very, it becomes very hard to know exactly what you mean. But if you say, we've got to get, we've got to get the militarization of police by grants and equipment from the Defense Department, makes no sense whatsoever. And we've got to get to a point where we're not trying to solve mental health problems and addiction problems with policemen carrying guns. There are a whole series of issues which police now are really forced to take on because they're kind of the place of last resort, which police shouldn't be taking on. So I think there's a very clear agenda in that area. And obviously, all the issues of economic disparity and education, the kind of support needed for historic Black colleges, and right down the list. There's a series of steps forward, but beneath that, I would hope that if Vice President Biden is elected, that he could really lead an effort that continues to beckon the nation to this time of real racial reckoning, in a way in which President Trump has been utterly unable to do. Sometimes I think of the model in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Desmond Tutu led, that tried to get to the deeper issues of entrenched white supremacy and what it took to move through that, and to then try to have a process that brought voices together in a way that reckoned with the moral responsibility. I think I would love to see a President Biden, if he's elected, try to figure out how to initiate a process at that level, as well as the specific legislative efforts that I think will be required.
Yeah, I think that kind of leadership was essential. I think, we need some major initiatives. It's not just going to happen by itself.
It's not. It absolutely is not.
It hasn't for the last couple centuries. So it's like, it's going to take some major pushing and major, conversations, and move the ball gradually, but we got to move the ball.
Yep.
So beyond, racism, I realize that there are so many things that are interconnected, but what other kind of policies do you think are the most important areas of focus going forward?
Well, I go to one fundamental thing that I think has really gotten us into trouble, and that's what typically goes under the slogan "America First." This isn't what initially rises to the surface if a person asks that question. I mean, you might turn to healthcare and turn to housing, turn to a whole series of specific issues. But I think getting through, to say, America First is one of the most unbiblical things that a politician or a president can say, and that never has really been called out. The sense that our rights, our privilege as a nation, and that mostly means privilege for those in the nation who are privileged, that they come first, and they come before all else. They come before the rights and the privileges, the aspirations of other countries, and often it means other people who aren't like us. And it means that we put first our self-interest in such a way that it really denigrates the shape of our partnership with others, and that we then get a view of ourselves as a nation, which says we are above reproach, that that our prerogatives comes first, and that we can trust in the rightness of what we want to do. That is very dangerous and is a huge departure from the way in which most presidents have tried to help us think about our identity and our role in the world. And I would like to see a new president who really, resets that discussion, because I think that's fundamental to much else. And then there are a series of other policies, of course, I'd like to see, but I would actually start at that point, Brian.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I agree with you in terms of the importance of it, and also kind of the anti-Christian nature of it.
Yeah.
But this president has pushed us so far, further away from that than even previous presidents, that I think it's going to take a lot of work to.
It would. It absolutely take a lot of work and a lot of courage. But especially as we think about our role in the family of nations, and think about what is it that we have to offer, and how do we relate as the richest and most powerful nation in the world? How do we bear that responsibility towards our global partners? I think that's pretty fundamental, and I think a lot of damage has been done there. And I think there's some pretty deep theological issues for those of us who are Christian that we need to raise and need to think about in this context, that in ways that are very helpful, in ways that are, that other presidents, frankly, have. I mean, you go back to Abraham Lincoln, his famous quote. It's not that I want God on my side. I'd like to think that we're on God's side.
What concept?
Yeah, I mean, a real, a healthy measure of humility in thinking about what does it mean to relate to God and to God's purposes in the world. I mean, this whole silly controversy over under God and the Pledge of Allegiance. I mean, if we had a careful conversation, what does it mean to even say as a nation that we are under God? What obligations and expectations should that put on us? That's the discussion that I'd love to see us have.
Well, along those lines, a few minutes ago, you talked about, one of your observations from the 2016 election that I felt myself, which was that there was this large part, particularly the middle part of the country, but large part of the country that, was alienated, felt they were being, disregarded, ignored, left behind, whatever, words you want to use, by people on the coast.
Yep.
And kind of the quote unquote elites.
Yep.
So how do we have conversations, and what kind of conversations? Where should they be? What should they look like to try to understand each other, I guess is, for lack of a better term, or come to some, common denominators that maybe, we can agree on.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there are people and initiatives that are trying at least to do this in the midst of a really polarized situation. I think how it begins is trying to reach out, trying to be present to those who have really felt forgotten, who have felt left behind, who have felt underappreciated, and to try to understand from them what their real aspirations are. Some of those folks may have some quick political things like, we should we should have prayer in all of our public schools. It's just things like that. But if you go beneath that, I think what they're really saying is that we, the values of respect, of family, of hard work, and of honesty, of appreciation for folks who take religious faith seriously. I think that's what that's what they're really yearning for. And you can, in fact, I look at what someone like Vice President Biden has done, partly because he's a lifelong and sincere practicing Catholic. I look at what he's been able to do and just how he listens and relates and participates and appreciates. That's kind of what people are really hungry for. I remember in Hillary Clinton's campaign, I know Iowa pretty well because when I was general secretary of the Reformed Church, we have a lot of congregations in Iowa, and there's some in that part of the Reformed Church that's probably the most politically conservative in our whole denomination. And I remember Hillary was at an event in one of the smaller towns in Iowa, and someone asked her, he said, "Well, what about your religious faith?" And she said, "Well, I've been a Methodist all my life. I have a Bible at my bedside. I read it. I appreciate these verses. It really helps me and sustains me." It was an off-the-cuff, unscripted kind of response. And I said, now that's what people want to know. The problem was that in her campaign, those who were running it, they paid virtually no attention to religion, and they kind of thought that didn't get them anywhere. And so you never heard that about her, as opposed to, like, for instance, what you heard about Obama. It's not that those who have felt bypassed and neglected and sort of culturally disparaged. I mean, that's what many of them feel. It's not that they expect people in D.C. to agree with everything they agree with, but they want respect. They want at least to be understood, and that their values are values that, they shouldn't be completely discounted, even though you may have a differing specific political agenda. So I think that's the way it needs to be. I'll give you one other example. I was listening to Judy Woodruff on PBS interview Jill Biden, and suddenly Judy asks her, after the death of Bo, you said at one point that you nearly lost your faith, but then you came back to it, or something happened. Could you talk about that? And so again, Jill Biden, completely off the cuff, says, well, yes, I had a real crisis of faith. And about 6 years ago, Joe and I were in South Carolina at a Democratic, we were at a campaign event. And it's probably one of the 3 times Joe was running for president. But anyway, a woman came up to me and said, "Dr. Biden, I want to be your prayer partner." And she said, "I didn't even know what a prayer partner is." But we started communicating. She started praying. We were in touch. And that brought me back to faith and to the just appreciating that presence in my life. Now, you see, what voters want to hear from politicians about God is what is authentic to them. They don't want to hear canned speeches. They don't want to hear, I'm in favor of, like, if you're on the left, I'm in favor of all we do for the poor. If you're on the right, I'm in favor of protecting life and of family and stuff. Okay, that's kind of predictable. But what they want to know is what's authentic for you, and how might that affect the way that you carry out your role. That's more important, actually. And I think getting interchange at that level is what I think is needed, Brian, when you say, how can we overcome this divide?
So Wes, you led a large mainline denomination for many years. What advice do you have to the religious leaders, pastors, in terms of what they tell people, what they tell their congregations, what they should be leading or saying and doing, leading up to this election?
Well, I tell you, I think that this election, amongst other things, is one of the most difficult for pastors. And it's difficult because many pastors sense that the issues in this election go deep into matters of who we say we are as Christians. And, it's much different than, the race between Obama and McCain, say, or, you just go through the past presidential races. And because of that, they feel that they want to, or that they should say something from their pulpit that helps those in their congregation. But yet, they can't, and they don't want to, and they shouldn't tell them how to vote. So what do? I think, again, you have to hold up those more basic values and practices that I mentioned towards the beginning of our conversation. Pastors need to talk about the role of truth. I mean, truth is important, because if truth gets diminished at a national level, then why should your kids tell you the truth when you're around the kitchen table? I mean, this cuts deep. The what I like to call the whole role of memory, and by that, what is the story that really shapes us? When when we're in a congregation and celebrating the Lord's Supper or communion, what we're doing is we're saying, this is the story that shapes and defines our life. This is how we live. And this is the narrative that we should be, that should be shaping us in our outward life. The question of solidarity. What does the Bible say about who we should most identify with, and about those who are those who are really suffering and not at the edge of society? I think pastors need to hold up those deeper practices and values, and say here, as they share the word and share from Scripture and share during this election time, here are the things that should be central to us. Now they're inevitably going to offend some people, but I think many others will appreciate. What they shouldn't do is say, I'm going to be silent. I'm not going to get involved in politics, and so I'm not going to talk about this at all. Because this is on the minds of everyone that's in their congregation.
Absolutely.
And the people in their congregation, that they don't want to be told how to vote, but they want to be told how to pray and how to think and how to, what they should count as important. So I think there's a way pastors could do that.
So let's just to wrap up, what would you say that was the most important outcome of the election that you would like to see?
I think the most important outcome of this election would be a decision reflected in the result that says a large majority of Americans want to live out of the basis of hope and out of the basis of compassion, rather than be driven on the basis of fear. If you were to ask me, Brian, what as a pastor, if I had to say one sentence to, like say every member of the Reformed Church on the night of November 2nd, as a pastor, what would I say? You know what it would be? It would be not afraid. Be not afraid. Fear not is said 356 times in the Old and New Testament. That's what we need to hear. And I'll tell you one story to close. When I worked with the World Council of Churches on its staff, it was during the time of Gorbachev and when the Eastern Bloc and the Berlin Wall was starting to fall. But before that had happened, when there were demonstrations led by churches and candlelight processions in East Germany. One of our World Council presidents was a bishop, Bishop Johannes Hempel, from the East German Church. So this guy's in a tough situation because East Germany is controlled by the Stasi, but he's a bishop and he's president of the World Council of Churches. And we asked him, he said, Bishop Hempel, in this time, because no one knew what was going to happen, but in this time with people, tension, people in candlelight processions in the streets, what do you say to your people? And he turned to look at us and said, I say, be not afraid. I think that's what we as Christians need to hear at this moment, Brian.
Yeah. Wow. Such great advice, and focusing on hope and compassion, as you said, as opposed to hate and fear. What a concept. I mean, that's very fundamental stuff and very important stuff and very much back to the Bible, right? That, we all need to ground ourselves in. Well, Wes, I just appreciate so much that you spend some time with us.
Thank you.
And we're going to circle back together and do an interview when it gets closer to your book launch. I want to hear more about that, and I'm sure our audience does too. So for now, thank you so much, and God bless.
Thank you. Bless you, and appreciate this time deeply.